Hi everyone. I had hoped to get to these story analysis videos sooner, but over the summer, unfortunately, I was diagnosed with macular degeneration, which means I've been getting some treatment and some shots in my eyes, learning to work with reading again, and things are getting a little better now, and I wanted to get into these videos. The idea is story analysis. We're going to take a look at a story and try to show you where it succeeds and where it fails in structure, and hopefully help you improve your own stories. That's what we're about today. So, welcome back to the DreamForge channel. This one's for writers. Today's challenge is The Boneyard. It's an intentionally flawed story, and it's one that I created because we're in the middle of a submissions period now with DreamForge Magazine, and I had a particular story that sort of hit a number of marks that I wanted to point out, but I don't want to call out the author and say, oh, well, these are things you did wrong, and certainly not in public. So what I did was I took their fantasy story, transformed it into a science fiction story, and duplicated many of the flaws that they had demonstrated in their story so that I could talk about them. And this doesn't make them a bad writer. It just makes them, like most writers, people who have a little bit to learn with story structure and plotting, at least if they're submitting to me at DreamForge. There are many ways to tell a story. Today we'll be talking about one that we look for specifically when we're looking at your manuscripts. So let's get started. Okay, the story we're going to look at is called The Boneyard, and it's actually a teaching example I put together for my first-line readers who help us read and evaluate submissions as they come into the magazine. This gives them an idea of the kind of thing I look for in stories. So let's start reading. The three students stood at the edge of the Kepler Station ship repository, watching twin suns paint the hulls of decommissioned vessels in shades of copper and gold. And this is where I made my first editorial note. Note that this is not the best opening. It's not a super opening line, but it is a good opening line. And it orients the reader with sensory detail and a clear setting. We know where we're at. Let's keep going. Chen adjusted her protective goggles against the glare. Beside her, Marcus whistled low, his breath fogging in the recycled air of his envirosuit. Ravi bounced on his shoes, barely containing his excitement at finally seeing the legendary Boneyard where humanity's first-generation starships finally came to rest. And this is where I make my second note. It's still continuing on a good pace. We have a good orientation. We know who, three students. We know where, the ship Boneyard. And we know when, this is in the future. What? They're exploring. Okay, so in those two paragraphs, I have a good opening that orients me to what's happening in the story. You'll note our reader engagement meter is still at 0. All stories start at 0. It means that the reader is willing to give you an initial suspension of disbelief. We're going into the story. We're hoping it's going to be good. You haven't lost any points. You haven't gained any points. We're still reading. And that's something, even at the beginning, when you have a 0, that's a good thing. All right. So, I can't believe we're actually here, said Ravi, his voice crackling through the comm. This is where the Prometheus-class ships are stored, the first ships to break light speed. So a little bit of background there. Scroll down just a little. Okay. Technically, they didn't break it, Chen said, pushing her dark hair behind her ear in a way she always did when correcting someone. They folded space around. Now here is where we start to lose points. I'm actually going to take this down to a -25. We've got a logic gap here. How did she touch her hair in her spacesuit? We've already been told they're in envirosuits. Okay, logical lapses like this one are common either in early works or just in first drafts. And here we have one that takes us out of the suspension of disbelief. We don't quite understand how that could be the case. Whatever, Chen, you know what I mean. Now, here's a note, not necessarily, all editorial notes are not bad notes. I'm just making notes where I notice things that are important to me as the editor in terms of evaluating this story. And this note says, dialogue reveals character personalities naturally. So you don't have them trying to talk about, the world or give us background information or, world build. They're basically just talking. And that's what we want to see in dialogue. We want to see them reveal emotions and reveal themselves and their personalities. And here we have someone saying, whatever, Chen, you know what I mean. You're revealing personality. Marcus laughed. Can we just appreciate that we got approved for this field study? Do you know how many engineering students applied? 237. And Professor Okonkwo picked us. They walked forward into the graveyard of ships. Row upon row of vessels stretched toward the horizon, each one a monument to humanity's expansion into the cosmos. Some were massive colony ships, their hulls scarred from micrometeor impacts. Others were sleek military cruisers decommissioned after the Centauri Accords. Now, what we've got here through this whole thing is we've got a little bit of world building, okay? And you want to keep that as short as you can. This isn't bad. This isn't a red flag to me yet. I do have a slight red flag in that this character, Marcus, as he's laughing, he's basically providing exposition. I don't necessarily like to see characters provide exposition directly about the world. Sometimes you can do this. It's a neat trick when you can have them say something that reveals information that the reader needs to know. Other times it sounds like the reader is just using the character and their dialogue to try to tell you about the world, and that's when you start to lose me a little bit as an editor. Okay, look at this one, said Ravi, pointing to a ship that seemed to shimmer in the double sunlight. That's weird. The hull looks, I don't know, different. Now, at first, when I see this sounds good to me, and I make my note, here's our something unusual, because that's how you build a story. It's not just about talking about the world. It's not just about introducing the characters or have them, act in front of you. It's about bringing the reader into the story. Something has to happen that engages those characters in a forward-moving development of plot. And this seems like something that would start that. Now, it could be what we call the inciting incident, but notice it's kind of vague. And the other thing that I notice as I read a little more, no one reacts to it with urgency or treats it as a problem to solve. They're, a little bit curious. Chen squinted at it, probably just the angle of the light, or maybe a different alloy mix. Early ships used all kinds of experimental materials. Should we check it out? Asked Marcus. Sure, why not? Said Chen. Now, here I'm really starting to get a red flag. Let's put a red flag stamp on it. And my engagement with this story is still negative. It hasn't dropped to the point where I'm ready to send this back yet, but you're not getting me above 0. You're not even getting me above minus 25. So sure, why not, said Chen. What's the problem here? This is a critical weakness. The characters have no agency here. They're tourists, not problem solvers. There's no hook that personally engages them. They just kind of shrug and go, why not? There's no stakes, no urgency. Nothing's threatening them or requiring them to make a meaningful choice. What would you do to fix that? They changed direction, walking toward the shimmering ship. As they got closer, Ravi consulted his datapad. According to this, that's the SSV Meridian, one of the early science vessels launched in 2187, decommissioned in 2201, only 14 years of service. That's unusual, said Marcus. Most of these ships ran 30 or 40 years minimum. Sure, why not, said Chen. Notice how big my editorial note is at this point. This is a critical weakness. This tells me immediately the characters have no agency here. They have no reason to be in this story other than as sort of bystanders or tourists. They're not problem solvers. None of them are personally engaged in anything that's going on here. They just kind of shrug and go, why not? That means there are no stakes. There's no urgency. There's nothing threatening them or requiring them to make a meaningful choice. What would you do to fix that? First of all, as an editor, this is probably realistically where I'm simply going to return the story. I'm not really even going to see if something in the middle is good or if the ending ties up well, which it's possible those things could happen. But right now it's telling me that my characters are not really involved in the story here, and I'm not going to follow them any further. And we have to make decisions very quickly, so we don't have the luxury of reading stories past the point where we know there's a critical flaw. They changed direction, walking toward the shimmering ship. As they got closer, Ravi consulted his datapad. According to this, that's the SSV Meridian, one of the early science vessels, launched in 2187, decommissioned in 2201, only 14 years of service. That's unusual, said Marcus. Most of these ships ran for 30 or 40 years minimum. Maybe it had problems, suggested Chen. Here I'm reinforcing what I've already said. There's still no real narrative hook. That's when one of the characters gets personally involved in the story. Something's drawing them in because it means something to them, either to their future, that, or where they're going to fail, or something that threatens them or threatens their family. They're just basically standing here looking out at the Grand Canyon and reading the directory cards in front of them or whatever. This is what it looks like. So this is the point where the story should escalate. They should discover something that creates a problem they must solve, or makes them vulnerable, or threatens them. Instead, they just sort of stand there and watch what happens next. Chen was the technical expert of the group. Everyone knew that. She'd grown up on Mars colony, where her parents had both worked in atmospheric processing. If I hadn't already decided to send the story back, this is another big red flag. We're dissolving into backstory and exposition instead of moving the characters forward through the story. This is telling instead of showing. Now, sometimes telling is necessary, but what we see here, I'm actually going to just take this entire section and say yada, 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 yada. Because we are just talking about the backgrounds of these characters and the backgrounds of their world. Here, his great-grandmother had served on the Defiant during the Belt Wars. He'd initially enrolled in the military academy, yada, yada, yada. Ravi was the newest to space. So it just goes on with still more backstory instead of present action. And it continues. Born on Chennai, he'd spent his whole childhood staring up at the stars. And again, in my mind as an editor, I'm just going yada, yada, yada. So the other thing to notice here by this point is we have 3 characters but no clear protagonist. The story treats them all equally, which means the reader doesn't know who to invest their emotions in or whose journey to follow. And this is a structural, critical problem. Keeps going. The 3 of them had met during their first year at the academy. More exposition. We're still not back in the present scene dealing with those shimmering ships. And that's what I want you to do as the editor when I'm reading your story. Stay with the experiential moment is what I call it. What's actually happening to the characters as they proceed through the story? What decisions are they making? What are they doing wrong that gets them in more trouble, that causes the problem to escalate? What decisions, what conflicts do they have? If you have 3 characters, why aren't they having conflicts with one another? Why isn't one of them saying you should do this and another one saying you can't do that? Why aren't they getting mad at one another? Why isn't there emotion involved? So I don't at this point understand why there are 3 characters, other than that the author wanted to just have 3 chums standing there experiencing things. And I'm just being told about the backgrounds of the world and the characters rather than seeing them actually deal with something in the moment. And it just goes on. We talk about, but somehow it worked. They balanced each other out. Chen kept them focused. I don't care about any of this stuff. And then in their first year, here they are in the boneyard. So it's almost like we took a break from the actual story moving forward and spent, I don't know, almost 2 pages just talking about stuff before the author brings us back to the idea that, hey, they're in the boneyard. Well, we knew that at the beginning. And then there was a shimmer of the ship. And then they all just kind of stand around saying, maybe we should take a look at that. And then we talk about them in the story. Don't do that. Structurally move the story forward. You obviously are going to have thoughts about my reader needs to know what's happening in the background of this story and who these people are as far as their backgrounds and the world and all that stuff. Largely that instinct is wrong. If you write the story and you stay with the characters and you stay with what they're doing, all those details you've built up in your mind are going to come out in one way or another. And if they don't, and if you read the draft later and you say, oh, well, the reader's not going to know what's going on unless I explain something here, explain as little as possible, as briefly as possible, in little like salt that information. Don't, stop and just take a teaspoon of salt and try to eat it. Sprinkle it over the work. That's what you have to do to keep the reader with the story. This would have been sent back long ago, but at this point, we're definitely, down to the 0, send it back. No interest in this whatsoever. Here at the end of the beginning, we're finally getting around to the point where one of them, Marcus, says, said Marcus as they approached the Meridian, I read about this ship once, something about an experimental drive system that never quite worked. What kind of drive system? Asked Chen. I don't remember. It was one of those mysterious ships articles, the kind that talk about ghost ships and weird disappearances. So here at last, we're at least, again, back into the idea of there's something interesting going on here, but none of the characters are being, personally involved in this yet. And That's what we want to see in the middle. We want to see a problem that they're driven to solve. We want to see that problem getting complicated. We want to see them getting in trouble and this whole thing escalating toward a climax where they have to make some kind of decision, life or death decision. Okay, so that's the beginning, or the end of the beginning. And next time we'll move into the middle, where we see escalating conflict leading toward a climax, or at least that's what we hope we see. But what did we learn, just in a really quick summary? Well, the story opened decently well with a good opening line, a good orientation. It let us know where we were, who we were dealing with. But where it started to fall down was in the area we call the inciting incident and then the narrative hook. Now, the inciting incident is when something happens that's a little out of ordinary for the scene that's been presented. And that's when the three students see the glowing or shimmering ship. That's something unusual, and we can kind of get this psychological signal, oh, the story, the actual plot progression is starting now. Now, where it fell down was that inciting incident doesn't really seem to mean anything to the students. It's just sort of a curiosity. It's like, oh, there's a thing. Should we go look at it? Okay. Now, shortly after, or often combined with the inciting incident, we want a narrative hook. And a narrative hook I would define as what actually takes the protagonist, or, if you're going to treat all these three characters equally, all of them together, that gives them personal stakes in the thing. So that if we're reading a story in which, an ambulance goes by the building in which our protagonist is in, that's an inciting incident, perhaps, that, something happened. But what would a narrative hook would be that protagonist saying, oh, that's my brother's on duty in that ambulance today. He, recognizes the vehicle or something like that. He now has a personal stake in the story, a protagonist. And if a second later he hears an explosion, now he's drawn into the story because he has a brother who's responding to an emergency event. There's been some terrible explosion. He has a personal reason to engage in what's happening. And that's what needs to happen here in this story in one way or another. That shimmer and that ship needs to mean something to these characters, or mean something at least personally to one of them, in a way that draws them into problem solving and figuring something out. And that doesn't happen. Instead, it leaves the characters as tourists who are just watching what's going on. And then the story devolves into background and exposition and, world building in the worst sense of the world, where we're just talking about the characters and their backgrounds and talking about the world that they live in and talking about the relationships between them and how things have gone. And that's not keeping us in the story. That's losing our interest very dramatically, very quickly, because we don't care. The author cares about this because that is the person who's dreamed these things up and wants to convey them to you and wants to bring you into the world, but they don't care to the reader. The reader wants to be in that story, in that forward movement. And if there are things that we really need to know about the background and how things relate and how these characters relate to one another, then it has to be brought out in that action as it moves forward. And if you do have to resort to telling something, sometimes you do, to be able to make the story make sense, you salt it in very little increments, as subtly as you can. You want a flavorful story. You don't want a tablespoon of salt dumped into the middle of your meal. So, and that's kind of what we get. And that's when I went yada yada yada, because it's just paragraph after paragraph of background that doesn't move the story forward or engage me in the story. So far in the beginning of this story, it's been a failure. It would have been sent back by this point. But this is a teaching story and hopefully something we can look at. So in our next video, let's look at that middle and see how the story progresses or doesn't progress through a series of obstacles or problems that mount toward a climactic moment in which the characters change or in which the characters learn something. Until next time, thanks for being with us. Bye-bye.